Hello and thank you for joining me. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm recording this presentation on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I'm going to discuss a literary tradition from the Middle Ages where a child speaks out, ostensibly on his own behalf. However, his act of speaking out is only possible because it represents the values and interests of his elders. And I'd like to tease out whether or not this offers any insights into the limitations or expectations around the speech or speaking out of living children in the medieval period in England. The examples occur in the Seven Sages of Rome tradition, an enormously popular medieval storytelling cycle which derives from an ancient source believed to date to the 5th century BC, probably originating in India and related to the Book of Sindbad. How it was transmitted to the West is unknown, but it had certainly appeared in Europe by the middle of the 12th century. The Seven Sages of Rome is thought to have been translated into nearly every European language and survives in hundreds of manuscripts and early printed editions. 8 Middle English metrical versions are preserved, thought to be derived from a single French ancestor, and a Middle English prose version also survives, as well as a Middle Scots and a Welsh version, not to mention early printed editions as well. Although there are numerous variations, it's fairly stable in some respects, which is the framing narrative, in which a young prince is educated by 7 of the wisest minds in the kingdom of his father, the emperor. His stepmother wants to deprive him of his inheritance, and so she casts a spell that will result in his death if he speaks during the following 7 days. She then accuses him of attempted rape, causing his father to call for his execution. He cannot defend himself, of course, because he will die if he speaks. But he and the sages learn of her plans in advance by reading the moon and stars, and so they set about organising a means of protecting him. For each of the 7 days following his sentence, one of the sages tells a story warning the emperor of the wiles of women, and thus delaying the execution by another crucial day. The empress counters each day with stories about lords being exploited by underlings. On the final day, the 8th day, the prince can speak for himself, and he tells a tale of a father who is frightened that his son will eclipse him, and he attempts to murder him and believes that he has successfully done so. However, the son not only survives, he prospers, and he eventually returns to rescue his father who's fallen on hard times, as well as to forgive him. This story paves the way for the prince to directly accuse the empress, which results in her confessing and causes her to be executed. Now, this story cycle represents an exemplary vision of sorts about childhood and about education, but it's one that distorts actual pedagogical practice. Not only is the prince taught by the best of minds, but he's taken out of town so that he cannot be contaminated by distractions that are typically thought to tempt young boys. Medieval children were routinely punished with beatings in the course of their educations, and this quote that you see here suggests that removing the child from distractions removes the requirement of beatings. So it's quite clear that they feel that by being in town, the child is likely to pick up deceptions, tricks, both in act and in speech, and that if they take him away to an ideal study spot, that he will, as it says in the last line, hear no villainy. He won't be corrupted. The constant looming threat of beatings is something to keep in mind as we explore these idealised representations of boys and their learning. Successful learning was closely associated with fair speech. It's through speech that wisdom, learning could be demonstrated. It's also through speech that a child could demonstrate their disposition towards their peers, towards their elders, demonstrate their social competence generally, And together they really formed a part of what was known as nurture, which correlates loosely to the modern idea of upbringing. In this case, very much though, a system that facilitated relationships amongst men, and one that was very, very heavily invested in using formal and courteous language. You can see the significance of that in this formulaic rebuke that the emperor offers to a number of the sages. He tells them in various forms that they've had his son for 7 years. They were supposed to teach him, and instead the child cannot speak. And this is a serious indictment. It's tantamount to a claim that the child lacks intelligence, the fact that he cannot speak. So closely are those things connected to each other. And I've just put underneath this quote, these verses from Proverbs that also show that connection between the need to physically discipline children, to not flinch so that they can learn, and that you see in the last line that the reward for the parent or the overseeing adult is when the child's lips speak right things. So again, the desired outcome of education is the ability for the child to speak in ways that an adult approves of. And obviously medieval culture was drawing on these ideas from biblical as well as classical influences and formulating them in ways that were specific to the period. Ben Parsons' book on punishment and education is very useful to look at on this topic. Now, the ethical and intellectual and social significance of the prince's speech, when he does speak, is also given further clarification in the way that it contrasts with the stepmother's vocal registers. She begins her manipulations of the emperor by sighing sorely or sorrowfully whenever they are alone in the bedroom at night, and that prompts him to ask what is wrong with her. And this, you can pause and read this quote through if you like, but it's the first fullest example of that strategy. Now, Killis Campbell, who was a 19th century student of this textual tradition, saw the king as being weak in that he seesawed between the different kinds of advice he was getting. It seems to me, though, that this repeated formula presented by the wife points towards the dangers posed by women who can exploit their intimate emotional bonds with men. They get to speak to men outside of these networks of male communication, and can use emotional manipulation to impact the thinking of their male partners. And that is a sort of a systematic problem that women will always represent in this kind of view of language as a courteous means of bonding men together and facilitating understanding between men. Now, you'll notice that the Empress introduces her stories through blatant emotional manipulation in an intimate setting where advisors cannot be. The very fact that the king is asking her what is wrong demonstrates to an extent just how much she is really disrespecting his authority. I don't have time to elaborate on that now, but I think that that's actually quite a strong implication of what's happening here. The prince, of course, only exposes the stepmother's lie after showcasing that he has exceeded the wisdom of his own teachers by telling the most pertinent and powerful narrative of them all. Now, maintaining the king's honour is the implicit goal of the sages and prince's course of action. Of course, the sages could have gone directly to the king and told him, the emperor, I'm sorry for confusing emperors and kings, they could have gone directly to the emperor, and yet they couldn't, because it would be dishonourable for him to be exposed and humiliated in that way. The threat of dishonour is raised by both sides in the tales that they tell. And so although this narrative seems to be about the life of the prince himself, the tales all in some sense reflect on the king's own honour. And the concluding lines of the framing narrative, actually the last 20 or so lines, they deal with the emperor's life and death, not the son's, which really renders transparent that the actual interest of this long cycle of stories is not the fate of the son. It's actually the father's unequivocal entitlement to obedience, to authority, to have his honour maintained by those around him, and the extent to which people will go to enact that. Now, I'd like to compare this with the significance of fair speech in a different narrative, the 15th century Middle English Tale of Beryn. This is a reworking of a French romance that's related to another branch of the Seven Sages tradition, in fact an older branch that's known as the Dolopathos. It shares the narrative problem of the scheming stepmother, but it features only one mentor and no stories from the stepmother are provided in this tradition. And the French Berenice narratives adapt the tradition further by integrating the contents of the tales into the narrative frame itself. So it's no longer a recounting of tales, it is that the main characters actually live out the events that were recounted in the tales in some of the other versions. So the Berenice is a departure in itself, but the English version of the Beryn narrative differs substantially from its source as well. In the English tale, the stepmother's interference is very weak and it's not life-threatening in particular. The tale, though, overall retains the focus on the literally life-saving properties of virtuosic rhetorical skills, the wisdom that generates them, and the role of the older male mentor through whom they must be acquired. So Beryn in the Middle English narrative begins life as a spoilt child as a result of being born late to noble parents who had difficulty conceiving. He received no discipline and as a result engaged in every undesirable form of emotional dysregulation and antisocial conduct that adults would normally subdue during this period with physical discipline. His father gives his young adult son an ultimatum, and Beryn decides to become a merchant. So he is well provisioned with a number of ships, but they're blown off course in a storm and he finds himself marooned in an unknown town. The population there sets about fleecing him through ingenious legal claims. They take not only his merchandise and the ships, but also lay claims on his own actual body. A blind man initiates a suit for his eyes, claiming that they're his own eyes and that he lent them to Beryn years earlier. So Beryn is almost literally being taken apart. He's so helpless. He has no defences against this onslaught. He falls into abject despair. He understands how his lack of a proper upbringing has left him defenceless. But that realisation, crucially, is not enough to save him. You see in the top quote that he has the awareness that those childhood beatings that would have supported his learning didn't occur, and to endure the equivalent as an adult is simply pushing him towards despair and failure and immobilisation rather than inspiring him to change his ways. He can't do it by himself. He is fortunate enough to attract the attention of a wise elder who at the time is living as a beggar for complicated reasons. But this elder is actually trained in law and sets about reversing the legal abuses that are being enacted against the hapless young man, who, as a result of the trusting bond that they develop, is able to learn and, like the prince, to become wiser than his mentor. So you'll see down the bottom that an extremely afraid Beryn listens to Geoffrey speak to him, Geoffrey who is doing his best to win Beryn's trust. And it says part of his wisdom streamed into Beryn's heart because of his eloquence. So again, it's that really tight-knit association between wisdom, eloquence, emotion and connection between men that these tales all revolve around. The Tale of Beryn effectively presents an argument that young men, no matter how promising they might be as raw material, if you like, simply cannot realise their potential without establishing an effective and obedient bond with a wise older man. As a young man who was never punished as a child, Beryn has had to experience the most abject failure possible to understand how much he needs other men, thereby shoring up the system. This narrative makes clear that children are induced to participate through punishment, and that is a completely right and proper way for them to become inculcated into the system. It emphasises the cyclical, self-perpetuating nature of this system of nurture, but it fails really to register that it is in part coercive. Now, finally, the last tale that I want to talk about today is Jack and His Stepdame, which has not been recognised as an offshoot of the Seven Sages tradition, but very strongly appears to represent a comic variant of the same key ideas, this time located in the social milieu of the yeomanry. This stepmother threatens the child's well-being by depriving him of food and trying to send him from the household. Jack is effectively silenced in a fashion not dissimilar to the prince, not by magic, but again by the danger of exposing his father to the shame of having a wife working deceptively against his own interests as the head of household. That could only be shameful for the father. The stepmother utilises the discourse of plaint or complaint to try to turn the father against his son, a form of emotional manipulation resembling the empress's sighs and sorrowing, one that similarly exploits their intimacy and their emotional connection away from the more formal avenues of advice. Now, Jack is sent out to the fields to care for the animals, a compromise by his father to the stepmother's request that he be sent to another household. And while out there, Jack encounters and courteously engages with an old man, a beggar, somewhat like Geoffrey of Beryn. Jack speaks well, he offers food, they exchange oaths and promises, and the formal language allows these two males who are unknown to each other to negotiate a bond that results in protection for Jack. Again, there is the food, but it's very much really about the exchange of appropriate language. I've just put these two, it's quite long, the dialogue. I've put these two stanzas here with some of the oath and promise words highlighted in bold, because quite interestingly, even though the older man promises Jack 3 gifts, which would appear to put Jack in the position of power, actually Jack wants to stop at 2, and the older man insists, he obliges Jack to pick a 3rd gift because he's promised it. So Jack would be causing him to be false to his word if he didn't take that 3rd gift, which again is an interesting reflection on the the binding that language does between males. And again, I apologise, I seem to be in the way down here of a quote of Jack speaking to a friar whom he's punished, but the point is that Jack says to the friar that the stepmother has complained to him about Jack, and he can see no other remedy than that he must go back and complain to her about Jack's punishment of him. The friar and the stepmother are in cahoots, if you like. So there is that contrast between the formal, honourable language and the sort of the emotional, accusing language of the complaint that is associated with femininity and the somewhat emasculated figure of the cleric in this text. Now, the comedy of the narrative arises as Jack sets out to punish the stepmother surreptitiously through the 3 magic gifts bestowed upon him by the old man. And so in lieu of tales, Jack is able to protect himself in part through the music made by the magical pipe he's given, and indeed in place of the final tale told by the prince to the father that convinces him, Jack plays the pipe for the father, and so that the music that he creates, it becomes the substitute for the tale, and it is used by Jack. Jack stops Jack asks the father if he'd like him to stop, and Jack signals his obedience to his father's wishes through the playing of the music. So it again shows the young the young protagonist prioritising the father's honour over his own needs, and concludes with a demonstration of obedience over the father. And so, to conclude, the shared fantasy, if you like, of all three of these narratives is that without a selfless commitment to older males, young males will lose their place in the system, in the social system, and with it they will lose their very selves. The narratives suppress the possibility that these young males might forge alternative connections for themselves. They'll simply die or fail to prosper if they don't comply, enforcing dependence in the guise of cooperation. These tales circulated within a cultural context where physical punishment was routine and indeed considered to be a virtuous response to signs of inadequate learning or insubordination in children. In this ideological framework, speaking out, as we tend to think of it now, as in voicing opposition to predominant ideas and practices, or simply articulating the child's own needs, experiences and perspective, this kind of speaking out would most likely have been taken as a sign of failed learning, failed nurture, and it would therefore have been met with a need for correction, so with punishment. Now, when these literary boys speak about their own needs, it just so happens that those needs are revealed as aligning with the interests of older men, the same older men who can offer them protection, which is secured when the boys demonstrate their compliance with the interests of their elders. Now, while this, of course, there's no evidence that this was adhered to in any way in practices relating to live children, the very popularity of this tradition suggests significant interest in this ideal of loyalty, which suggests to me an alarming level of constraint that may have been directed at the utterances that were considered to be acceptable from lived children, which can be correlated, of course, with courtesy literature and other sources. So thank you for listening, and I will leave it there.